Well, I'm going to get started, even though it's 2 minutes early while everybody's sort of shuffling to their seats, because the ambassador is on a tight schedule today. I know the airlines always say they put on extra flights because of Thanksgiving, but it seems this year it's the opposite. And so the range of choices for getting in and out of Houston were a little more complex than we were hoping today. We're very pleased to have the IEA come and do their annual report. This year it's a particularly interesting year in light of all the turmoil we've had, both with the financial crisis and the ups and downs of the oil market, the road to Copenhagen. It's a very exciting year in energy and not without its challenges. And so we're changing the format a little bit today. Usually we have a very long presentation and a short Q&A, but we felt that there's so many different, really rich elements to the report for this year that we've asked the ambassador to shorten a little bit, just a little bit, his formal presentation to allow a little extra time for Q&A from you, my expert audience. I feel we're the most educated audience we can offer Ambassador Jones, who's doing like a 10 whirlwind city tour with the study. So I want him to know that we are the energy capital, and we're going to listen very carefully to his remarks and have questions and comments. I think one of the interesting things that is going on in the market, that some of which come from originally from the IEA. Ambassador Jones was talking to us over lunch about an informal group of organizations that are looking at getting endorsements from international automobile companies for fuel efficiency standards 50 by 50, and I'll leave the ambassador to explain what that means, but really enhancing energy efficiency in the automobile sector by 2050 in a substantial way, with a goal both for fuel efficiency and energy security, and also as a means to tackle the greenhouse gas emissions issue. And the other really interesting thing I think we have going on sort of at the edges of the energy world is the ambassador used to sort of describe this bipolar world where we had the OPEC countries and their secretariat and their analysis, and we had the International Energy Agency and its secretariat and its analysis, and then sort of a loose dialogue between those two organizations. And the world has become very, very complex today, and we have in this latest go-round with the financial crisis an emerging sort of forum of the G20. And the complicated feature of the G20 is that some of the members of the G20 are in OPEC, and some of the members of the G20 are in the IEA OECD system, and some of them are not affiliated with either party. And so it was very interesting earlier this year to see the G20 make an official announcement about the phase out of fuel subsidies and the sort of difficult role that fuel subsidies play in stabilizing countries that have poverty and in increasing the burden of growing oil demand on the global economy, and also in providing economic problems for the governments that have to fund those subsidies. So that's also sort of an interesting and controversial area where the IEA is participating to provide the data and support for the G20 to look at a controversial topic like the role of fuel subsidies, especially in the developing world. And in light of the context of how OPEC feels about the imposition of energy taxes in the OECD, so the ambassador has his hands full in being the deputy director of the International Energy Agency in this last year, and probably has more in store for him in the coming year, maybe more intense than in the past year. And we are very lucky and very honored to have such an accomplished diplomat in that position, helping with the International Energy Agency, with a career of more than 30 years of diplomatic and policy issues ranging from the Middle East to trade to energy security. And it would take me the whole rest of the day to explain to you how many different countries from the Middle East the ambassador has served in. But let me just say he has tipped his hat at almost every important conflict and resolution that we have seen positively over the last 2 decades, and it's really a great pleasure to introduce him to speak to you today.
Well, thank you very much, Amy. The problem with getting such a glowing introduction like that is you have to try and live up to it. I hope I'll be able to do that. I really am delighted to be here at the Baker Institute, and I want to thank Amy and her people for organizing and hosting this event. As she mentioned, our intention today is to present the IEA's World Energy Outlook. It's an annual look at key global energy trends. The report was released for the first time on November 10th in London, and it's already been presented in a number of capitals around the world, in Europe, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and in the coming days across the United States. My intention is to speak for 20 to 25 minutes and then leave time for your questions. I'll start off by mentioning what are the things that are different this year. Well, the main difference is really the change in context. In particular, you've got the worst economic slump since World War II. Maybe there's a recovery underway. If you look at the stock market, every day there's a different answer. It is, it isn't. If you look at oil prices, you wonder as well. But even if it is underway, how fast will it happen? And then, of course, we had the boom and bust in oil prices. We had a slump in energy investment earlier this year. It seems to be coming back, but it's still not entirely clear whether we're going to get enough investment to avert a supply squeeze. And then finally, and again, this is something Amy alluded to, we have the negotiations coming up in Copenhagen. Will they succeed? Won't they succeed? What does success even mean for such negotiations? The important question is, how will they affect the energy markets in the future? So to try and answer some of these questions, this year the IEA developed 2 scenarios. Last year we did 3, but we dropped the middle scenario. And I want to emphasize at the outset that neither of these scenarios is a forecast. In fact, particularly the one scenario, the business as usual scenario, we hope doesn't happen because it's a pretty scary scenario. It is a baseline scenario of how global energy markets would evolve if governments made no changes to existing policies and measures. The second scenario is called the 450 scenario, which if you were here last year, you may remember, or if you read articles about the World Energy Outlook. This scenario depicts a world in which collective policy action is taken to use energy efficiency and a variety of low-carbon technologies to move to a more secure path that is economically and environmentally sustainable. This path limits the long-term concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to the equivalent of 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and hence the name, the 450 scenario. By the way, if you believe in global warming, or if you believe in the models that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses, such a concentration of CO2 would lead to a rise of about 2 degrees centigrade in world temperatures by the end of this century. So I'll spend a few minutes or a few slides going over the so-called reference scenario or business as usual scenario. This slide shows the global primary energy demand. You can see that, in fact, in around 2009, if you look at the middle of the chart, the global energy use is set to fall. This is the first time since 1981 that we've seen a fall in global energy demand on any significant scale. Of course, it's a result of the financial and economic crisis. But on current policies, you see that it's only a blip, that the growth in global energy use will quickly resume its long-term upward trend once economic recovery is underway. In the reference scenario, we see demand for global energy demand increasing by 40% between now and 2030. That sounds like a big number, but when you realize that we're talking about 20 years from now, it's not such a big number. Also, I want to emphasize that this scenario is based on an optimistic, well, I shouldn't say optimistic, but a desirable path for global economic growth, 3.1%. And again, is 3.1% a high figure? Well, when you consider that we have population growth and that we have rapid economic growth in many developing countries today, and you look at what 3.1% global average means for countries of the United States and Western Europe, it means very modest growth, probably lower than historical growth has been. So we don't think 3.1% is an overestimate at all. But if you just think about how energy intensive our economies are, and you use that growth figure, you come out, even on relatively optimistic assumptions, with an overall growth in world energy demand of 40%. Non-OECD countries, by the way, account for more than 90% of the increase in demand in 2030, because that's where most of the growth is actually taking place. China accounts for almost 40% of the global increase in primary energy use alone. India accounts for another 15% of the global increase. Outside of Asia, the Middle East sees the fastest rate of increase, contributing 10% to incremental demand. Not surprisingly, fossil fuels remain the dominant sources of energy worldwide in this scenario, accounting for nearly 80% of the demand increase between 2007 and 2030. Although oil demand is expected to drop by a little over 2% in 2009 as a whole, it is projected to recover from 2010 as the world economy pulls out of recession, rising from around 85 million barrels per day in 2008 to 105 million barrels per day in 2030, an increase of around 24%. All the growth occurs from non-OECD countries. OECD demand actually falls. That's why on the line for oil there, you've got the yellow bar to the left, because OECD demand is falling. Over the same period, total global demand for coal grows by 53%, largely due to power generation in India and China. Global natural gas demand grows by 42%. Of course, modern renewable energy technologies grow. In fact, they see the fastest rate of increase. But their share of total energy use is so small today that even by 2030, they're only taking about 2% of world energy demand. But that's up from less than 1% today. Looking a little bit in greater detail at oil, we see that net of processing gains in refining, oil production rises from about 83 million barrels per day in 2008 to 103 million barrels per day in 2030. But if you look at this slide, and I apologize, it seems a little dark, but the light blue, which is evident in the 2030 bar, is crude oil that is from fields that have yet to be discovered or developed. And you see that's the huge source, that's the biggest source by far of oil in 2030. In fact, we believe that we need additional capacity of around 63 million barrels per day, which is 6 times the current production of Saudi Arabia by 2030. 2/3 of this is just to offset declining production from existing fields. You see, it's like we're on a treadmill. It's bad enough that the demand for oil is growing, but the supply of oil that we currently have is always declining. Last year we did a very big study of like 800 oil fields, and we found that the average decline rate once an oil field is past its peak is 6.7%. And is likely to increase over time, meaning that the depletion rates will accelerate. So we see that 2/3 of the new capacity we need to develop is just to replace existing capacity that won't be here in 2030. And only 1/3 of it is for the growth in demand. And this is why there are a lot of people that are skeptical that we can accomplish such a scenario. Of course, where does this oil come from? Well, most of the projected increase in output comes from OPEC countries. Their output rises from a little over 36 million barrels per day in 2008 to almost 54 million barrels per day in 2030. This means their share of production, world production, grows from about 44% now to more than 50% in 2030. That means on this scenario, OPEC's market power is increasing. In fact, production has already peaked in most non-OPEC countries. But fortunately, the decline in non-OPEC conventional production is more than offset by rising unconventional output. Global unconventional output rises from less than 2 million barrels per day in 2008 to greater than 7 million barrels per day in 2030. This slide takes a look at what happens in natural gas in this scenario. This year, just as we did last year for oil, this year we did an in-depth study of gas fields to determine their natural rate of decline. We looked at more than 600 fields. We saw that in the reference scenario, gas supply increases by 42% from 2007 to 2030. But based on the results of our detailed field-by-field analysis, together with assumptions about ongoing field development, we calculated that output from currently producing fields in aggregate will increase marginally between now and 2015, but then begin to fall back to only half of their current levels as they deplete and their production rates decline. So taking into account of this, we project that the additional capacity, or that we need additional capacity of nearly 3 trillion cubic meters by 2030 to satisfy world demand, which will exceed more than 4 trillion cubic meters in 2030. To put it into perspective, this capacity is 4 times current Russian capacity. It's just like the oil. We're on a treadmill. The demand, it's not that the demand is increasing so rapidly, but it's that the existing fields are being depleted. In the case of gas, it's about 50-50. There is a bright spot, though, that I want to mention because I'm in oil and gas country, and that is that U.S. unconventional gas production may help to meet the increase in demand that we're seeing. In fact, U.S. unconventional output has expanded nearly 4 times since 1990 and is now almost 300 billion cubic meters as of last year. And it's more than half of total U.S. gas output now. We believe that on current trends, by 2030, the output from non-conventional gas in the United States could exceed 600 billion cubic meters. Now, how are we going to produce these large increases in capacity in both oil and gas? The only way to do it is through investing. However, since the start of the financial crisis, the tougher financial environment, weakening final demand for energy, and falling cash flows have all sharply reduced investment throughout the energy supply chain, from production to end use. We estimate that global upstream oil and gas investment budgets for 2009 have been cut by around 19% compared with 2008, a reduction of over $90 billion. This is the first such drop in a decade. Sustained lower investment in supply in the coming months and years could lead to a shortage of capacity, another spike in energy prices in several years' time, just when the economy is finally on the road to full recovery. So, in fact, I don't have a slide on it, but our overall estimate for investment in all forms of energy in the reference scenario between now and 2030 is $26.5, I think it is, trillion dollars. We believe on average the world needs to invest more than $1 trillion a year in energy in the reference scenario. About half of this is in oil and gas. Most of the rest is in electricity. Part partly as a result of the increase in demand, and as I mentioned, the increase in the share of production that OPEC gains. The reference scenario implies an increasingly high level of spending on energy imports. This means that there is a threat to our security as we become increasingly dependent on foreign sources of oil. Looking forward, OECD countries are projected to spend on average close to 2% of their GDP on oil and gas imports to 2030. The burden is even higher in most non-OECD countries, i.e. the developing world. And you can see this compares to the average between 1971 and 2008, when for OECD countries it was basically around 1%. China was also around 1%. And whereas our share is going to double to 2%, China's triples. India, which has been averaging 3%, is going up to 6%. That's should be a source of concern for both of those countries. And if you look at it in monetary terms, China overtakes the United States soon after 2025 to become the world's biggest spender on oil and gas imports. India's spending on oil and gas imports surpasses that of Japan soon after 2020, and it becomes the third largest importer after China and the United States. Now, I mentioned we have an alternative scenario, the 450 scenario, which is a more environmentally sustainable, but it's also a more secure forecast, or not forecast scenario. In that scenario, oil and gas import bills in OECD countries in 2030 are much lower than they were in 2008. And in fact, in 2030, the oil and gas import bill for China is 30% lower than the figures shown on this screen, and for 30% lower in China and 31% lower in India. So there is some hope. I mentioned the 450 scenario. It's based on certain policy assumptions. I mentioned the reference scenario assumes business as usual, existing policies. This slide shows the policies that we assumed in generating the 450 scenario. This was work done for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and therefore it stresses climate-related policies. We see, if you look at the slide, a combination of policy mechanisms. We tried to make the policies we chose as realistic as possible. Obviously, in a work like this, you cannot do more than 200 countries at a time. So what we did is we broke the world into three groupings. There's the OECD plus countries, which are basically Western Europe, North America, and a few countries in Europe that are in the EU but not yet in the OECD. Then we have a group called Other Major Economies, which includes Brazil, China, the Middle East, Russia, South Africa, and then all other countries, which, by the way, includes India. So even though India is a rising consumer and will become a major player in energy markets, because of their low per capita GNP, we kept them in the other country category, which has a less stringent demands on them. We took what we call a graduated approach. Between now and 2020, we assumed that there would be an evolution of a cap-and-trade system, so that all OECD plus countries would have national emissions caps. But only after 2020 do we assume that other major economies adopt emission caps. And so that the focus in most countries, certainly all other countries, but also in other major economies and even in the OECD plus, a lot of the focus is on what we call national measures. These are policies like we want to reduce the average amount of energy used in our fleet of vehicles, things like that. But also we talk about some sectoral arrangements, sectoral agreements in electricity and iron and steel and cement and so on, where an industry gets together and all the major players in that industry agree they're going to reduce their emissions by a certain amount, or they're going to increase their energy efficiency by a certain amount. The other thing, though, that we found, if you want to reach 450 parts per million, you have to go down. In fact, you have to have a peak in your emissions right around 2020. Perhaps if you can do it before 2020, the sooner the better. The only way we see that happening is if you have some way of imposing a price on carbon emissions. And the price that was used in this scenario is $50 a ton for power generation and industry. So these are the assumptions. And I want to stress, though, that the 450 scenario shows only one possible configuration of how the energy sector could respond to a deal in Copenhagen that limits concentration of emissions to 450 parts per million. And remember, this is equivalent to a rise in temperature of 2 degrees centigrade between now and the end of the century. In comparison, the path we're on in the reference scenario would see 1,000 parts per million and 6 degrees increase in global temperatures. And most people that are working in this field believe that if you have that kind of an increase in global temperatures, you really don't know what's going to happen. Because once you get above about 3 degrees centigrade, you start melting the permafrost in the Arctic. And all of a sudden, a lot of vegetable matter, which has been dead for thousands of years but has been locked in ice, starts to decay. And you get massive amounts of carbon dioxide coming into the atmosphere from decay of dead vegetable matter in the north. We admit that this scenario is very ambitious and is going to be difficult to put into practice. But nevertheless, we believe it represents one way in which to pursue the climate targets which are now being discussed. And in fact, it's designed to be one of the least costly ways of achieving these objectives. In fact, I mentioned the investment that needs to be required to meet the reference scenario, over $26 trillion between now and 2030 worldwide. This scenario requires an additional $10.5 trillion. So you're talking $36 trillion between now and 2030. The bright side, though, is you save almost $9 trillion in fuel costs. In addition, you have lower pollution, which leads to longer lifespans, particularly in some developing countries. We estimate, in fact, 1 billion man-years of life extension as a result of the change, the reduction in emissions due to this scenario if it happens. Getting into a little bit more of what we actually see happening in the 450 scenario, this is a slide that shows the evolution of world primary energy demand by fuel. Fossil fuels are the top line, and then you have the so-called zero carbon fuels and their share in a percentage term. And this shows that the policies and measures of the 450 scenario have considerable impact on energy demand, especially for fossil fuels. By the way, we assume that the prices for fossil fuels would change broadly in line with the reference scenario until 2015. Then demand for oil and gas and coal start to diverge from the reference scenario, and you get lower prices. And that's one of the reasons why you have $9 trillion, or nearly $9 trillion in savings. So what happens? As overall demand grows, but only by 20% instead of 40% between 2007 and 2030. This is an average rate, annual rate of 0.8%. For oil, we only reach 89 million barrels per day by 2030 instead of 105 million barrels per day in the reference scenario. So in some sense, this is an easier scenario to achieve, at least from the oil and gas perspective. And in fact, we see a peak demand for fossil fuels by 2020 in this scenario. Coal actually plateaus by 2015 and is already falling by 2020. Oil demand is only 0.2% a year increase between 2007 and 2030. Gas grows by 0.7% per year. And what happens is gas becomes a transitional fuel. It begins to substitute for coal, especially in power generation. And that's very important because natural gas is a lot cleaner than coal. It emits half the emissions that coal does in a conventional power plant. Overall, by 2030, in consequence, we see the carbon content of a unit of GDP to be less than half of today's level. So there's a great improvement in GDP per carbon. This takes a little bit of a look at the oil production. I'll just talk about it briefly. We think that these measures to reduce emissions will improve energy security by reducing global fossil fuel energy use. Oil imports to the U.S., the European Union, and Japan will be significantly lower in 2007. Now, imports into China and India continue to grow, but they grow much less quickly than in the reference scenario. But the interesting thing is, because of the decline in non-OPEC production, even though the demand in the reference scenario, or in the 450 scenario, is 16 million barrels per day less than in the reference scenario, compared to today, you still see 11 million barrels per day, more than 10 million barrels per day, in the demand for OPEC production. So we reduce the amount of increase, but we do not eliminate the increase. So even in the 450 scenario, OPEC's market power is still going to be growing, and their revenues. This is a slide that shows the distribution and the reduction in emissions between the various regions. I mentioned there are three regions: the OECD plus region, which is the darker color on top; the other major economies, which is the middle sort of pale blue; and then the light blue or light gray, the other countries. The top part of this sort of wedge chart is the emissions from the reference scenario. So, for example, by 2020, there are a little over 34 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year. By 2030, they're right around 40 billion tons in the reference scenario. The bottom edge of the wedge is the 450. And you see what happens in the 450 scenario, that emissions begin to plateau around 2015, and they actually turn down around 2020. And then the area in between is the reduction in emissions. And then the wedges show how that reduction in emissions is divided. But what they don't show, by the way, and you might be surprised to see that most of the reduction in the emissions is not from the developed countries, it's from the other major economies. Well, that's because they're the ones that are growing the fastest. China says often, well, we're not responsible for this problem. You guys have historically emitted a lot more. Well, that is true. But the rate China is going, if they don't change, by 2030, that won't be true anymore. That's how rapidly China is growing. And therefore, consequently, the biggest reduction in emissions need to occur in the developing world. And this is why Copenhagen is so important. The developed countries can't get alone together and make the decisions, because if the developing countries don't play ball, we still get global warming. So and this is one of the reasons why the IEA, which is traditionally a rich countries club, we have 28 member countries, they're all OECD countries, it's why we spend most of our time these days talking to China and India and other countries in the developing world, trying to get them to understand the scope of the problem. The good news is they are actually starting to understand the scope of the problem. I should mention also the bars on the right. The bars on the right show not where the emissions take place, but how they're achieved. And you can see, if you look at this, that efficiency is the most significant element. It accounts for about 2/3 of the abatement in emissions between now and 2020. And still almost 60% by 2030. And energy efficiency measures and higher electricity prices due to the introduction of a carbon price in the power sector curb electricity demand growth in industry and buildings. Efficiency improvements to the internal combustion engine and the growth in hybrid and electric vehicles ensure that road transport also makes a large efficiency contribution. In 2030, around 60% of global electricity production comes from renewables, nuclear, and and power plants fitted with carbon capture and storage. This represents a step change from the reference scenario, where fossil fuels still account for 2/3 of generation. The scenario also assumes substantial emissions reductions in other sectors and for other greenhouse gases, as well as even sharper reductions in emissions after 2030. In other words, that bottom line keeps going down. It has to keep going down, because actually today we're probably above 450. So we actually have to start letting carbon dioxide come out of the atmosphere, and that means you have to get your emissions way down. In fact, this shows what happens to the emissions in several different countries, including the United States, China, India, Russia, and Japan, as well as the EU countries, between the two scenarios. So the solid lines are the reference scenario, and the dotted lines shows how those lines turn down after about 2010 in the future. And again, you can see that the biggest drop is for China. In fact, national policies under consideration today in China would bring about a gigaton, a billion tons of reductions by 2020. And that would, if they succeed in that, it would place the country at the forefront of global efforts to combat climate change. Because if you remember the previous slide, I'll just go back to it. By 2020, we only need reductions of 3.8 billion tons. Is that telling me I should wrap up? I actually am almost wrapped up. Again, I want to stress, while this chart shows the geographical distribution of reductions, it doesn't say who should pay for them. This is looking at what would happen in the United States. It shows how the reduction in emissions in the United States could be accomplished. If you look at the right-hand side, you see the role that efficiency plays, the major role that efficiency plays in the reduction of emissions in the United States, but also the shift to renewables. You can see that, for example, in 2020, renewables account for 43 megatons of reductions, but by 2030 that's gone up to 288 megatons. CCS, though, plays a very important role as well. This slide focuses particularly on the vehicle fleet. We see measures in the transport sector produce about 11 million barrels per day of oil savings in global demand by 2030. Road transport accounts for the vast majority of these savings. We see a dramatic shift coming in car sales. By 2030, conventional internal combustion engines represent only some 40% of sales, down from more than 90% today. Down from more than 90% in the reference scenario. Hybrids take up 30% of sales, and plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles account for the remainder. This shows the major shift that we expect to occur between the two scenarios in electricity generation for the United States. You can see that instead of seeing an increase in coal, we see a big decrease in coal. Instead of seeing a small increase in gas, we see a big increase in gas. Nuclear, hydro, wind all grow very rapidly in this scenario. Before I finish, I just want to say I'd like to take a moment to draw your attention to a striking number. Today, 1.5 billion people still lack access to electricity. It's almost 600 million in India alone. This is well over a fifth of the world's population. In the reference scenario, the number of people without access will only decline by 200 million in 2030. This would leave 1.3 billion people still without electricity in 2030. We think that has serious implications for human welfare and development. On the other hand, we looked at what it would take to give universal access to electricity. This, in fact, could be achieved with investment of only $35 billion per year, additional investment, which is just 6% of the power sector investment projected in the reference scenario. And we think this accompanying increase in primary energy demand, the impact on primary energy demand and CO2 emissions would be very modest. In fact, in some cases, you may see a reduction in emissions because the power that's being used may be less polluting than the fossil or than the fuels that are being used traditionally in certain countries. So this is my last slide, and I just allow me to sum up a little bit some of the key points. First of all, the financial crisis did lead to a pause in the rise in global fossil fuel energy use, but it's clear from our analysis that the long-term upward path will resume soon on current policies. We think that in order to tackle climate change and enhance energy security, we need a massive, massive decarbonization of the energy system, because we're now on course for a 6 degree centigrade rise in global temperatures. And to limit the rise to 2 degrees would require big emission reductions in all regions. We think a 450 path to green growth, so to speak, would bring substantial benefits, which would help avoid the worst effects and costs of climate change. It would also have energy security benefits, lower oil and gas imports, reduced energy bills, and much less air pollution, which would have huge health benefits. Natural gas, as I mentioned, can play a key role as a transitional fuel, a bridge to a cleaner energy future. But I want to stress the challenge is enormous. I mentioned the investment figures. Even the business as usual is $26.5 trillion. But we believe this can and must be met. Improved energy efficiency and technology deployment are critical. Each year that we delay, the necessary investment increases by $500 billion. So on that cheery note, let me thank you all, and I'm now happy to try and answer your questions.
Well, I want to thank Ambassador Jones for a truly interesting and very global and comprehensive presentation in a very short period of time. Let me ask you, if you have questions or comments, to come up to the microphone, because we are webcasting, and so even though there are many of you here with us today, we imagine 200 million other 18-year-olds watching online who can only hear if you come up to the microphone. So with that...
Can I wave to my daughter?
Yeah, please do.
I hope.
Yeah. So with that, let me invite members from the audience to come up with comments or questions for the ambassador. And please say your name and affiliation so we all know who you are.
So I'm Peter Hartley with the Energy Program at the Baker Institute and interested in the natural gas market. So, we showed us when you went from the reference case to the 450 case, the biggest increase, really, the big change was in natural gas. And you showed us the graph of you think is going to happen to the oil market, how it'll affect different suppliers of oil going from the reference case to the 450 case. But you didn't show us the equivalent thing for the gas market. So presumably you don't have that picture. If you do, that would be great. But maybe summarise, with this big change in the demand for natural gas, sort of where it would come from. And secondly, your final slide here, you've got lower oil and gas imports. So presumably with this big increase in natural gas, how can there be a big fall in gas imports? Thanks.
Good questions. You're right, I don't have a slide, but I can tell you orally. If I recall correctly, between the two scenarios, the demand for natural gas declines by about 17%. Between the reference scenario and the 450 scenario. But, and it's a coincidence, the actual demand for natural gas increases by 17% compared to what it is today. So that's why I can remember it, because both figures are 17%. With respect to your other question, I was lumping oil and gas together, and of course for an individual country you may see an increase in the imports. But what we're seeing is likely a fall in the cost of, because remember what we're talking about when I say the percentage change is the volume. And if the price goes down, the price times volume is the imports. So the imports can go down even if the volume goes up if the price goes down further. And we are seeing an impact on price. Because of the reduction in demand. Right now, and I didn't use the slides, but we also have done a lot of work on the natural gas market vis-a-vis the United States and the big change in the United States. There was an assumption as recently as a year and a half ago that the United States was going to need major imports of liquefied natural gas, LNG. And so there is a lot of degasification capacity in the United States. But more importantly, for the world gas market, there's a lot of liquefaction capacity that's been built in the Middle East, particularly in Qatar, but also in other places around the world. And because of the rapid growth in non-conventional gas, U.S. imports of liquefied natural gas have fallen. And in fact, there are people that believe the U.S. could actually become an exporter of natural gas. That's how strong the non-conventional gas has been growing. And so what that means, though, is that you've got tremendous capacities coming online between now and 2015 in the LNG liquefaction. And a lot of that was planned to come to the U.S. market, but the U.S. market is not likely to want it or to need it. So that gas has got to go somewhere. Because once the irony is, once these facilities are built, it's very cheap to run them. And these countries have so much natural gas, it's not like I'm going to save the natural gas for the future, because the discounted net present value of that natural gas staying in the ground is as close to zero as you can get. So they're going to continue to produce the gas. And this is really good news for Europe and European security, because it means that Europe won't be as dependent upon pipeline gas. And of course, most pipeline gas in Europe originates in Russia. So that means that from a geopolitical or geostrategic standpoint, the diversification of supplies means greater security for Europe. It also means that you're likely to see a change in the way natural gas is priced in Europe. In the United States, gas competes with gas, supply and demand. In Europe, which is relying on pipeline gas, and you usually have, and with pipeline, in order to justify making this huge investment in the pipeline, you have long-term contracts. And most long-term contracts in Europe, especially with Russia, are linked to the price of oil, not gas. Well, if you all of a sudden start substituting LNG from the Middle East and elsewhere for pipeline gas in Europe, that LNG is going to be priced on a spot basis, competing with other sources of gas. And so you're going to put pressure to break the link in Europe between oil and natural gas prices. And that's going to have a huge impact on natural gas prices in Europe. That's one of the reasons why we see gas prices going down. I hope that isn't too long-winded an explanation.
Other questions? Chris, you can make a little line behind the mic if you'd like.
I was interested to hear most of your discussion of fossil fuel demand dropping as a result of a desire to reduce CO2 emissions. I was just wondering what your stance on peak oil is.
Yeah, we believe that you're going to have a peak demand a lot sooner than you're going to have peak supply. We see that especially gas, there's tremendous amount of volumes of gas out there, especially non-conventional gas. And now we know we can produce it. But even in oil, we think probably only about half of the available oil has been produced. But having said that, we think that the oil that remains to be produced, the gas that remains to be produced, will be increasingly difficult to produce and will be increasingly expensive. So in effect, what we see is that oil becomes the high price energy, whereas now it's the low price energy. And that's one of the reasons why we think you see a shift more and more towards renewable energy.
In one of your slides, you had OPEC producing an additional 11 million barrels a day. And I'm just wondering, given their current production of about 30 million barrels a day, what makes you think they can deliver another 11 million barrels a day when I think only 2 of them have increased their production in the last 2 decades and all the rest are declining?
This is one of the real causes for concern, because we don't see an alternative to OPEC increasing its production. You're right, if OPEC doesn't increase its production, which is entirely within their capability, then that even accelerates the speed with which oil becomes a high-priced commodity, and therefore should accelerate the shift to other technologies. That's why I say was very careful to underline this is not a forecast, it's a scenario. Because, first of all, it's too far out to be able to know what's going to happen. But it's also because we want to demonstrate to people where the key Achilles heels are. And needing that extra oil from OPEC is a clear weak point. And that means if you don't trust OPEC, you've got to start planning for alternatives.
Yeah, I'm Bill Edwards with Edwards Energy Consultants. I have a problem with your first statement up there. The financial crisis led to the drop in energy use. When I look at the numbers, and I guess I got to admit, I'd focus on U.S. data because we get it so much sooner than we do the rest of the world. The demand for oil in the U.S. peaked out in 2007. The financial crisis didn't happen until the tail end of 2008. My assessment is that the thing that caused the drop in fossil fuel use was the price going up. And if that's the case, we are currently at the same price now as we were in 2007 when that price level caused demand to start falling. If that's the case, that bump you see next year on growth continuing is not going to happen. So it looks to me like that if we put our whole basis on the wrong cause for oil demand fall, then we can really mess up our outlook. Let me just mention one other thing is from what you said earlier, the drop, the high price of oil and the drop in the economy made things much better for the people concerned about CO2. So why don't we just ask OPEC to add another $100 a barrel to the price of crude, and they solve global warming?
Yeah, because then we're all living in tents. That's the problem. I mean, remember, I was very careful to say this scenario is based on a certain growth assumption. And what you're saying is, again, this is a scenario, not a forecast. Your forecast may be right, but if your forecast is right, it means we don't get the growth. And is that better than what we're saying? I mean, what we're saying is if you want growth, these are the things that logically we see have to happen. And if you don't think it's possible, then that means you don't think growth is possible, and that is itself a pretty gloomy outlook. So it's sort of you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
That's what the global warming thing costs you. You got to give up your growth.
Well, we think that there is an alternative, and that's what we're trying to sell.
Yes, Ambassador, my name is Ravi Stewart. I'm a student here at Rice University. Last week, we saw the unauthorized release of hundreds of emails from East Anglia University seeming to indicate a greater lack of consensus in the scientific community on the role of human activity in climate change than previously thought. How, if at all, has this impacted the IEA's position on global climate change?
Well, I think the simple answer right now, it hasn't had any impact because it's just too recent. One of the things I want to emphasize is that we're not a macroeconomic forecasting unit. We're not a climate unit. So for our macro figures, we take other people's figures. This is what the IMF and the OECD tell us that world growth is going to be, and for our growth assumptions. And when it comes to climate change, we take the figures from the IPCC. This is what they tell us. And I've heard about those emails, although I haven't read them. But I've also read a number of reports that suggest that on the ground, climate or temperatures actually appear to be rising faster than the models forecast. So it may be that yes, there is disagreement among experts, but it may be that they're all wrong and that it's even worse than we expect. We don't know. We don't pretend to duplicate their effort. We're always very careful, and I should have been more careful. But we're always very careful to say according to the IPCC to make it clear that these are not our numbers. But we estimate the emissions and then we use their numbers to say what that means in temperature. And maybe they'll change. We'll see.
Hi, Jonas Pradhan with Shell Oil. I have a question and comment related to the CO2 emissions. So basically, I understand we look at the CO2 emissions from the perspective of global warming. And this comes from the role CO2 plays as a greenhouse gas. But if we look at the hydrocarbons, when we burn hydrocarbons, we produce not only CO2 but water also. And water is also plays a role as a greenhouse gas or vapor, as vapor. And do these models look, the models that you use, do they look at water as a greenhouse gas or the greenhouse effect? Because looks to me like the policymaker insists a lot on the CO2 emissions, and they actually send a message to the whole world, and this is a big business opportunity, right, in the future. And there are other players there in the greenhouse arena. And if I can comment, you mentioned, for example, the permafrost. I think the permafrost defrosts. I think the rotting of the organic mass is not the first concern. I think the first concern would be emission of methane, which is locked in the permafrost. And methane is actually a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2 is. And also actually the same with water.
Yeah. To answer your question, remember I said 450 parts per million, equivalent to 450 parts per million of CO2. Our models do take into account the other greenhouse gases. I don't know about water specifically, but I definitely know methane is involved in that. And when I was referring to the melting of the permafrost, it was methane that was my biggest concern. Although I didn't mention it.
Okay, one last question here.
Good evening, Ambassador. My name is Radu Filip, and my question to you is, what are the main political drivers, motivations for China, India, the other emerging economies to reduce their emissions? The reason I'm asking this question is that the climate change seems to threat our way of life. We live in these big houses, we have plasmas, we have cars, every member of the family, and so forth. But as you've shown in the previous slide, 20% of the world population lives in these countries, and they are at the very basic level of Maslow pyramids of needs. So what incentives do these countries have to take the hard path into going towards the 450 scenario than to invest in fuel now and provide the better quality of life with the cost of the carbon now? Thank you.
No, that's a good question, and I think that if you followed the debate around the time of Kyoto, and even in the run-up to the Copenhagen, you've seen a lot of that we're not going to sacrifice our growth because you polluted the world in the past, and so on and so forth. But in fact, there's a lot of domestic support in these countries for changing the path they're on, because they've been incredibly polluting. Chinese cities have been very, choked with, sort of smog. I mean, typical pollution and particulate matter and so on. And a lot of the steps that China has taken, I mentioned that their current policies, and they're doing this on their own without any negotiation, will lead to 1 billion tons reduction in CO2. China didn't take those steps because they wanted to reduce CO2 by 1 billion tons. That's a side effect. They took them because their people demanded cleaner cities. And they also realize, and this is why I stress, we don't stress conservation. We don't tell people to do without. We tell people that you can do what you're doing now, but you can do it more cheaply, more efficiently. That's why we stress energy efficiency. Remember, 2/3 of the reduction we need between now and 2020, and almost 60% between now and 2030, simply comes from using energy better. And that means lower cost for your imports. And, in the West, we often have market failures where the people that benefit from energy efficiency aren't the ones who pay for it. So it ends up not getting done. China's a different society. They can sit there and say, this makes good economic sense. We should do this. And they can order it done, and it gets done. It's kind of scary, but it's happening. And so they're doing everything they can to ensure their energy future. Their companies are going all over the world, tying up reserves around the world in emerging producers. Already 1/4 of Kazakhstan's reserves of oil are under the control of Chinese companies. They're doing it in Africa. They're doing it around Asia. They're locking up supply for energy. At the same time, they're building their renewable energy industry. Most of the wind turbines that have been installed in Germany that are benefiting from the feed-in tariffs that the Germans have were made in China. They see it as good business. That's why they're doing it, and because of the domestic push from their own people. And India is no different. We've done a lot of work with India on energy efficiency, and they realize that if they use energy more efficiently, then they can spread it around to more people, and that improves their overall welfare. So the debate is kind of moving on from that sort of idea that there's a dichotomy between reducing emissions and growth. They're realizing that reducing emissions can actually contribute to growth.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, we need to get the Ambassador out to the airport, so I thank you all. I also thank the U.S. Association for Energy Economics for their support for this event, and of course, I look out in the audience and see many of our Energy Forum supporters, so thank you all very much for making these kinds of programs possible. And for those of you who don't have to beat the rush hour immediately, we have some food and drink and reception for you, so please feel free to linger and ponder the Ambassador's interesting observations. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. We will be in January having several big events. January 26th, we'll be having a big conference on clean tech, sort of the new Obama clean tech and the role of patent pools to get past some of the barriers to entry for new technologies. And in March, we have a big conference coming up in Abu Dhabi, looking at the new world of Obama energy and what it means for the global market and for the Middle East in particular. So thank you all very much for coming. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.